U.S. Supreme Court justices raised doubts Wednesday over the legality of President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs. Conservative and liberal justices alike sharply questioned U.S. Solicitor General B. John Sauer, who defended the legal rationale employed to impose the tariffs. Trump invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, a law that lets a president regulate commerce in a national emergency. Conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett questioned Sauer's claim that IEEPA's language granting presidents emergency power to regulate importation encompasses tariffs.
Can you point to any other place in the code or any other time in history where that phrase, together regulate importation, has been used to confer tariff-imposing authority?
Liberal Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said IEEPA was intended to limit presidential authority, not expand it.
Okay, something massive just happened that should have every Republican in America terrified right now. The Supreme Court just tore into President Trump's tariff powers during oral arguments, and at almost the exact same moment, off-year election results came in showing Trump's political coalition cracking in key states across the country. We're talking about a 1-2 punch that's sending shockwaves through the Republican Party overnight. The justices, including conservative justices that Trump himself appointed, spent hours questioning whether Trump even has the legal authority to impose the hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs he's been using as his signature economic policy. And while that was happening, election results were rolling in, showing Republicans underperforming badly in races where Trump's name wasn't on the ballot. Analysts are now openly warning about what they're calling a Republican collapse in miniature, and some are saying this could be a preview of what's coming in 2026. Can you believe this? Trump's legal aura and his political aura are both taking damage at the same time, and Republicans are suddenly waking up to how much risk they're carrying if both the Supreme Court and the electorate keep turning against his agenda. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Joining us now, CNN chief data analyst Harry Enton. Harry, we're talking about tariffs here. You're just hearing that conversation. Has Trump push for tariffs been successful in the minds of the American people?
No. No is the simple answer. I mean, I think that Americans have moved more against tariff than any other major Trump policy that he's been pushing during this second term. What are we talking about here? Well, why don't we just look at this? New tariffs on imported goods. You go back to November of 2024, the majority, 52%, were in favor of it. Look at where we are now in 2025, in the fall of 2025. 60% of Americans are opposed to Trump's tariffs. So we're talking about a 4-point margin in favor, switcheroo, now to a 20-point margin against. And of course, there was all this news coming out of the World Series, right? Canada tariffs. We're not just talking China, we're talking Canada and tariffs. And get this, we're talking about just 36%.
Let me break down what happened at the Supreme Court, because this is a huge deal for Trump's economic agenda. On November 5th, the justices heard arguments about whether Trump can use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose massive tariffs on goods from around the world. This is the legal foundation for basically everything Trump has done on trade policy. He's been claiming emergency powers to slap tariffs on China, Europe, Canada, Mexico, you name it. He's been saying he has the authority to personally control America's trade relationships, and the Supreme Court just spent hours casting doubt on whether any of that is actually legal. Coverage of the arguments described it as Trump's bad day at the Supreme Court. Justices from both the liberal and conservative sides were skeptical of the government's arguments. They questioned whether declaring a trade emergency gives the president unlimited power to tax imports. They asked pointed questions about whether Congress ever intended to give presidents this much authority over the economy. And legal analysts watching the arguments came away saying the court appears poised to strip away one of Trump's favorite tools, the ability to impose tariffs whenever he wants by claiming an emergency exists. The implications of a loss at the Supreme Court would be devastating for Trump. If the court rules against him, it could force the White House to unwind or refund large portions of his tariff regime. Billions of dollars in tariffs that have already been collected might have to be given back. Companies that have been paying these tariffs could be entitled to refunds. In Trump's promise to personally control America's trade policy, one of his signature campaign promises and governing priorities would be shown to be legally invalid. That's not just a policy setback. That's a massive symbolic blow to Trump's image as a president who can do whatever he wants through executive power. He's built his entire governing style around using emergency declarations and executive authority to bypass Congress and implement his agenda. And now the Supreme Court is signaling that approach might have legal limits he can't overcome. But here's what makes this even worse for Republicans. While the Supreme Court was questioning Trump's powers, voters were delivering brutal results in off-year elections. CNN's analysis called it a very bad one for Donald Trump's Republican Party. Exit polls and turnout data showed the GOP underperforming in key races. In states like New Jersey and Virginia, Republicans struggled badly, especially in suburban areas where they need to grow their coalition. The pattern was clear. When Trump's name isn't actually on the ballot, his magic doesn't transfer to other candidates. Voters who might support Trump personally aren't showing up for generic Republicans. And voters who are angry about Trump's chaos, the shutdowns, the legal battles, the economic uncertainty are punishing Republican candidates even when Trump himself isn't running. Post-election polling and model reviews are describing this as a Republican collapse in miniature. Not a full-scale disaster yet, but a warning sign of what could happen in 2026 if these trends continue. And the timing? Having this election data come in at the exact same moment the Supreme Court is signaling skepticism about Trump's tariff powers creates a perfect storm of bad news for the GOP. GOP strategists are reportedly in panic mode right now, trying to figure out what this means. Some are openly warning that Trump's legal chaos and court battles are eroding support in exactly the places Republicans need to win: suburbs, swing states, persuadable voters who might have given Trump a chance but are tired of the constant drama. Others are pointing out that the party has no clear plan for a future where Trump isn't at the top of the ticket, but his controversies still drag them down. They're stuck with all of Trump's baggage without the benefit of his unique ability to turn out his base. And if the Supreme Court takes away his tariff powers on top of all the electoral warning signs, Republicans could be heading into 2026 with a wounded president, a damaged economic agenda, and a coalition that's showing cracks in real time. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into exactly what happened at the Supreme Court, why the election results are so alarming for Republicans, how these two things connect, and what this means for Trump and the GOP heading into 2026. Let's break it down. All right, so let's get into the specifics of what happened at the Supreme Court, because this could be a turning point for Trump's entire economic agenda. The case centers on whether Trump has the legal authority to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known as IAEPA, to impose tariffs on foreign goods. This law was originally passed to let presidents respond to national emergencies by controlling economic transactions. It's been used for things like freezing assets of terrorists, sanctioning foreign governments, and blocking financial transactions with hostile nations. But Trump has stretched this law further than any president before him. He's been claiming that trade imbalances constitute national emergencies, and that those emergencies give him the power to impose tariffs on basically whatever he wants. He's used this authority to put tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods from China, Europe, and other trading partners. It's been the centerpiece of his economic nationalism agenda, the idea that Trump personally can reshape America's trade relationships through executive action without needing Congress to pass any laws. The Supreme Court arguments on November 5th exposed serious problems with this approach. Justices from across the ideological spectrum asked tough questions about whether Congress ever intended to give presidents this much power over trade. They pointed out that the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. They questioned whether declaring something an emergency gives the president unlimited authority to impose what are essentially taxes on imports. And they expressed skepticism about the government's argument that courts should defer to presidential emergency declarations without scrutinizing whether those emergencies are real or justified. The questioning was so hostile to Trump's position that legal analysts watching the arguments described it as devastating for the administration. Multiple justices, including conservatives, seemed to be signaling that Trump had overstepped his legal authority. Forbes coverage called it Trump's bad day at the Supreme Court and warned that a ruling against Trump could force the White House to unwind or refund large portions of his tariff regime. That's not just a legal setback, that's potentially billions of dollars that have already been collected, having to be given back to companies that paid the tariffs. The implications of losing this case extend far beyond just the tariff policy itself. Trump has built his entire governing approach around using emergency powers and executive authority to bypass Congress. He doesn't want to negotiate with lawmakers or build coalitions to pass legislation. He wants to govern by decree, issuing executive orders, declaring emergencies, and daring courts to stop him. The tariff case is a test of whether that approach is legally sustainable. And based on the oral arguments, it looks like at least some Supreme Court justices are ready to say, no, you can't do that. There are constitutional limits on presidential power, even when you claim an emergency. If Trump loses this case, it signals that his entire governing model has serious legal vulnerabilities. It emboldens other legal challenges to his emergency declarations on immigration, national security, and other issues. It shows that even a conservative Supreme Court isn't willing to rubber stamp everything Trump does, and it gives ammunition to everyone who's been arguing that Trump has been abusing executive power throughout his presidency. Now let's connect this to the election results, because the timing is brutal for Republicans. At almost the exact same moment the Supreme Court was questioning Trump's tariff authority, voters were going to the polls in off-year elections across the country, and the results were ugly for the GOP. In state and local races in New Jersey, Virginia, and other key states, Republicans underperformed expectations. They lost races they thought they'd win. They saw their margin shrink in races they did win. And the pattern in the data was clear. When Trump's name isn't on the ballot, his coalition doesn't show up with the same enthusiasm. CNN's analysis described it as a very bad day for Donald Trump's Republican Party and said the results crystallized the GOP's post-Trump problem. The party has become so identified with Trump personally that it struggles to win elections where he isn't the candidate. But at the same time, Trump's chaos and controversies are turning off the swing voters and suburban moderates that Republicans need to build a winning coalition. So they're stuck. They can't win without Trump's base, but they can't grow beyond that base as long as Trump's drama dominates their brand. The suburban results were particularly alarming for GOP strategists. Republicans have been bleeding support in suburbs since Trump first came on the political scene. College-educated voters, women, and moderate independents in suburban areas have been moving away from the party, and the off-year election showed that trend continuing. In places like Northern Virginia, suburban New Jersey, and similar areas across the country, Republicans got crushed. These are exactly the voters the party needs to win back if they want to compete in swing states and hold congressional seats. But as long as Trump is the face of the party, with all his legal battles, shutdown fights, and controversial policies, these voters keep moving further away. And the tariff case at the Supreme Court connects directly to this, because one of the things suburban voters care about is the economy, prices, stability, predictability. And Trump's tariff wars have contributed to higher prices on consumer goods, uncertainty for businesses, and economic volatility that makes people nervous. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump on tariffs, it's going to remind voters of all the economic disruption his trade policies have caused. And that's not a winning message for Republicans trying to convince suburban voters to give them another chance. The phrase Republican collapse in miniature that some analysts are using to describe these results is deliberately alarming, and it's meant to be. What happened in the off-year elections isn't a full-scale disaster for the GOP. They didn't lose control of any major institutions. They didn't suffer a wave election that swept them out of power. But the warning signs are there. The patterns in the data suggest that if current trends continue, if Trump keeps facing legal setbacks, if his policies keep generating controversy, if swing voters keep moving away, then 2026 could be catastrophic for Republicans. A miniature collapse now could become a full-scale collapse in 2 years. And GOP strategists know this. They're reading the same data, they're seeing the same patterns, and some of them are starting to panic about whether they've hitched their wagon to a star that's falling. The connection between the Supreme Court case and the election results is about more than just timing. It's about a broader narrative forming around Trump and the Republican Party. That narrative says Trump's approach isn't working anymore. His legal tactics are running into limits as courts push back. His economic policies are facing challenges that could strip away his key tools. His political magic isn't transferring to other candidates, and voters who might have given him a chance are getting tired of the chaos. When the Supreme Court questions your tariff powers on the same day voters deliver bad results for your party, it reinforces all of those storylines at once. It creates a sense of momentum in the wrong direction, and it makes Republicans wonder whether they're riding a wave that's cresting and about to crash. The post-Trump problem that CNN identified is particularly difficult for Republicans to solve. The party has no clear plan for what comes after Trump. His presidency is term limited, he can't run again, but his influence over the party is total. Candidates can't win Republican primaries without his support, or at least without mimicking his style. But those same Trump-style candidates struggle in general elections where they need to appeal beyond the base, so Republicans are trapped. They can't move past Trump without alienating their base, but they can't keep winning with Trump's approach as voters grow tired of it. The off-year elections demonstrated this problem in stark terms. Trump's base didn't show up with the same enthusiasm when he wasn't on the ballot, but his controversy still dragged down Republican candidates who had to answer for his shutdown fights, his legal battles, and his economic policies. All the downside of being associated with Trump, none of the upside of his unique ability to mobilize supporters. And now the Supreme Court might take away one of Trump's signature powers on top of everything else. If the justices rule that his tariff authority is illegal, it's going to be a major embarrassment and a significant policy defeat. Trump has staked so much on being the president who can personally reshape trade relationships, who can impose tariffs by decree, who doesn't need Congress to achieve his economic goals. A Supreme Court ruling that says actually you can't do that would undermine his entire brand as a strong executive who gets things done. It would show that his governing approach has limits he can't overcome, and it will come at exactly the wrong time politically, when voters are already showing signs of souring on Republicans and when the party is already struggling to hold its coalition together. Okay, let's break this down into clear points so you understand exactly what's happening and why it's so significant for Trump and the Republican Party. Point number one, the Supreme Court heard arguments on November 5th about Trump's tariff powers, and justices from both liberal and conservative wings expressed serious skepticism about whether he has the legal authority to impose hundreds of billions in tariffs by claiming trade emergencies. Coverage described it as Trump's bad day at the Supreme Court, with legal analysts saying the justices appeared poised to rule against him. If Trump loses this case, it could force the White House to unwind major portions of his tariff regime and possibly refund billions of dollars already collected. More importantly, it would be a massive symbolic blow to his governing approach of using emergency powers and executive authority to bypass Congress. Trump has built his presidency around the idea that he can do whatever he wants through executive action. The Supreme Court is signaling that approach has constitutional limits. Point number two, at almost the exact same moment the Supreme Court was questioning Trump's powers, off-year election results came in, showing Republicans underperforming badly in key races across the country. CNN called it a very bad day for Donald Trump's Republican Party. Exit polls and turnout data showed the GOP struggling in suburban areas and swing states, exactly the places they need to grow their coalition for 2026. The pattern was clear. When Trump's name isn't on the ballot, his base doesn't turn out with the same enthusiasm, but his controversies still drag down Republican candidates who have to answer for his chaos. Some analysts are describing this as a Republican collapse in miniature, not a full disaster yet, but a warning sign of what could happen if current trends continue. The timing of having this election data arrive while the Supreme Court was questioning Trump's authority creates a perfect storm of bad news that's shaking confidence in the GOP's political position. Point number three, the connection between the tariff case and the election results goes beyond just timing, because both reflect a broader narrative forming around Trump's declining political and legal momentum. His legal tactics are running into limits as courts push back on emergency power claims. His economic policies are generating uncertainty that's hurting Republicans with swing voters who care about prices and stability, and his political magic isn't transferring to other candidates who need to win elections where Trump isn't on the ballot. When the Supreme Court casts doubt on your signature economic policy on the same day voters deliver bad results for your party, it reinforces all of those negative storylines simultaneously. It creates a sense that momentum is moving against Trump and Republicans, and that's a dangerous place to be heading into a crucial election cycle. Point number four, GOP strategists are confronting what CNN called the party's post-Trump problem, which is that they become completely dependent on Trump's personal appeal while having no plan for elections where he isn't the candidate. The off-year results demonstrated this vividly. Trump's base didn't show up with normal enthusiasm when his name wasn't on the ballot, but his controversies, the shutdown fights, the legal battles, the tariff wars, the constant chaos, still hurt Republican candidates who had to defend his record. So the party gets all the downside of being associated with Trump without the upside of his unique mobilization ability. And they can't easily solve this because moving away from Trump would alienate his base, but staying close to him keeps driving away suburban voters and moderates they desperately need. The tariff case makes this worse because if Trump loses at the Supreme Court, it adds another controversy to the pile. It reminds voters of the economic disruption his policies have caused. Point number five, the implications for 2026 are enormous, because these warning signs are appearing well before the midterm elections, giving Republicans time to course correct, but also showing them exactly how much trouble they're potentially in. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump on tariffs, it's going to dominate news coverage and reinforce narratives about legal setbacks and overreach. If the patterns from off-year elections continue, suburban flight, base enthusiasm problems without Trump on the ballot, swing voter exhaustion with chaos, then Republicans could face a very difficult midterm environment. The party is carrying significant risk right now, and the combination of Supreme Court skepticism and electoral underperformance is forcing them to confront that risk whether they want to or not. Some strategists are already warning that 2026 could be catastrophic if Trump keeps losing in court and voters keep punishing Republicans for his controversies. Now let's talk about what happens next, because this story is still developing and the consequences could reshape the political landscape heading into the midterms. The Supreme Court hasn't ruled yet on the tariff case. The oral arguments were just the beginning of the process, but the skeptical questioning from justices suggests Trump is likely to lose. And when that ruling comes down, probably in the next few months, it's going to be a major news event that reinforces all the negative narratives about Trump's legal overreach and governing failures. The White House is reportedly preparing for the possibility that they'll have to significantly change their tariff policy or even refund money that's already been collected. That's going to be a huge embarrassment and a policy defeat that Democrats will hammer relentlessly. Meanwhile, the electoral warning signs from the off-year elections are going to inform Republican strategy for 2026, Do they try to moderate and appeal to suburban voters who are fleeing the party? Or do they double down on Trump's base and hope higher turnout from loyalists can overcome swing voter losses? There's no consensus in the party about which approach is right, and that internal debate is going to get more intense as the midterms approach. For Trump personally, this is a dangerous moment. His whole brand is built on winning, on being the guy who fights and wins, who uses power effectively, who gets results. But losing at the Supreme Court on tariffs would be a major loss. Seeing his party underperform in elections would be another indication that his magic is fading. And having all of this happen while he's simultaneously dealing with shutdown fights, impeachment threats, cabinet chaos, and dozens of other legal battles creates a sense that he's losing control. Trump's political strength has always depended on appearing invincible, on convincing supporters and opponents alike that he can't be beaten no matter what gets thrown at him. But the Supreme Court skepticism and the election results both challenge that narrative. They suggest Trump can be beaten, that his power has limits, that his approach isn't working as well as it used to. The economic implications deserve attention too. Trump's tariffs have been controversial precisely because they raise prices for American consumers and create uncertainty for businesses. If the Supreme Court strikes them down, it might actually help the economy by removing trade barriers and reducing costs. But for Trump, it would represent a massive policy defeat and would eliminate one of his key tools for projecting strength on the world stage. He wouldn't be able to threaten tariffs as a negotiating tactic anymore. He wouldn't be able to claim he's protecting American workers through trade policy. And all the companies and industries that have adjusted to his tariff regime would face another round of disruption as policies change again. The economic chaos that would result from unwinding Trump's tariffs could actually hurt Republicans politically even more than keeping the tariffs in place. Here's the bottom line. The Supreme Court is casting serious doubt on Trump's authority to impose tariffs through emergency declarations, and at the same time, voters are delivering election results that show Republicans struggling without Trump on the ballot while still suffering from association with his chaos. These two developments together represent a potential turning point for Trump and the GOP. The legal aura that protected Trump's expansive use of executive power is cracking as courts push back. The political aura that made Trump seem invincible is fading as elections show his coalition weakening, and Republicans are suddenly forced to confront how much risk they're carrying if both trends continue into 2026. This isn't a full collapse yet, but the warning signs are flashing red. The Supreme Court case could strip away Trump's signature economic power. The election results suggest his magic doesn't transfer to other candidates, and the party has no clear plan for navigating a future where Trump's controversies drag them down, but his unique appeal isn't available to bail them out. So stay tuned, because this story is going to keep developing as the Supreme Court ruling approaches and as Republicans try to figure out their strategy for 2026. The overnight collapse narrative, Trump's legal and political standing both taking damage simultaneously, is the kind of storyline that can reshape political dynamics quickly. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump on tariffs, it's going to be a massive story that dominates the news cycle. If Republicans keep underperforming in elections, it's going to fuel panic about whether they can hold Congress in the midterms. And if both things happen, if courts keep limiting Trump's power while voters keep punishing his party, then the GOP could be heading into 2026 with a wounded president, a damaged agenda, and a coalition that's falling apart in real time. That's the nightmare scenario Republican strategists are staring at right now. And based on what happened at the Supreme Court and in the election results, that nightmare might be closer to reality than anyone wants to admit.